On February 5th, 2026, Cuba's national electrical grid experienced a catastrophic failure that left Santiago de Cuba, the island's second-largest city with over 400,000 residents, without power for 26 consecutive hours. During peak demand hours, 64% of the entire island lost electricity simultaneously. The Antonio Guterres power plant, one of Cuba's largest generators, went offline, eliminating 200 megawatts of capacity. Energy analysts at Capila, which tracks global petroleum flows via satellite, stated in late January that Cuba could function for 15 to 20 days at then current consumption levels with remaining reserves. That timeline has now expired. Without new shipments, Cuba isn't facing rolling blackouts. It's facing total grid collapse. No electricity means no water pumping, no refrigeration, no hospital equipment, no public transportation, and no fuel distribution systems. The Cuban government has implemented a 4-day work week for state employees, reduced school sessions to half-time, restricted interprovincial transportation, and closed non-essential public services. These measures aim to preserve fuel for critical infrastructure, hospitals, food production, and water treatment. But they also represent an acknowledgement that Cuba cannot maintain normal operations at current oil availability levels. Cuba's water supply systems depend on electrical power for pumping and purification. When the grid fails, water stops flowing. Artemisa province reported an 83% reduction in water availability. Havana experienced an 80% reduction. Millions of Cubans now face simultaneous fuel and water shortages, unable to cook, clean, or maintain basic sanitation. Cuba's Minister of Public Health, José Ángel Portal Miranda, announced in early February that hospitals would substantially decrease surgical activity. The reason? Surgical procedures require significant electricity consumption and minimum safety conditions that the collapsing grid cannot guarantee. Elective surgeries are canceled. Emergency procedures are delayed. Patients are sent home to rest without treatment because facilities lack the power to operate safely. Provincial hospitals report shortages of critical medications, including painkillers, antibiotics, and gauze. Some facilities lack electricity to refrigerate essential medicines, rendering temperature-sensitive drugs unusable. Cuba is experiencing a triple epidemic: dengue and Oropouche virus with 626 confirmed cases, 76 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, 25 encephalitis cases, and chickenpox with 38,138 cases. In 1 week in early February, 33 people died from these diseases, including 21 minors. Hospitals lack diagnostic reagents, treatment capacity, and the electricity necessary to maintain equipment. The state-owned company Metalip is expanding production of plant-based syrups, oregano, eucalyptus, aloe vera, marketed as treatments. The regime frames this as innovation. The reality is there's nothing else. Modern pharmaceuticals require imports that demand foreign currency Cuba doesn't have, or domestic production requiring electricity Cuba can't generate. When hospitals offer herbal syrups instead of antibiotics, it's not a choice. It's the only option remaining. In early February 2026, food prices in Havana reflected a total disconnection from official wages. Potatoes cost 450 pesos per pound, onions 380, beans 500, and meat 1,000. A single modest grocery purchase for basic staples cost 10,300 pesos. Meanwhile, average state workers earn 6,300 pesos monthly. Teachers earn 5,495 pesos. Healthcare workers earn 6,162 pesos. A doctor earning 4,500 pesos, approximately $16 at informal exchange rates, cannot afford rice, chicken, or toothpaste in a month's salary. This is what maximum pressure produces in practice: hospitals without power, people without water, wages that can't buy food, and a population that's lost 1 million people to immigration since 2021. That is 18% of the total population fleeing in 5 years. The humanitarian catastrophe is documented. Now the strategic question: can the regime survive what's coming? And if it can't, what happens next? On February 5th, President Miguel Díaz-Canel stated that Cuba is willing to engage in dialogue with the United States on any topic, but without pressure or preconditions. He emphasized that any talks must occur from a position of equals, with respect for sovereignty, independence, and self-determination, without interference in internal affairs. This frames Cuba as open to negotiation while drawing a red line. The political system, constitution, and sovereignty are not negotiable regardless of pressure. Diaz-Canel invoked the revolutionary slogan, "Homeland or death, we will never surrender," positioning the crisis as a test of revolutionary commitment against imperialism. He referenced the 32 Cubans killed fighting U.S. forces during the Venezuela raid on January 3rd, framing American actions as military aggression that Cuba must resist at all costs. President Trump stated in early February, "I think we're going to make a deal with Cuba," asserting that the United States is talking to the highest people in Cuba to see what happens. The White House messaging suggests imminent substantive negotiations, but multiple reports contradict this narrative. According to reporting based on accounts from 5 Cuban and American officials requesting anonymity, the deal Trump claims is near completion is not being pursued in any official high-level diplomatic discussions. The only confirmed substantive contacts between Cuban and American officials involve purely technical matters. The United States informs Cuba when flights with deported migrants will arrive, and Cuban officials acknowledge receipt. That's it. There are no negotiations on sanctions relief, political reforms, or crisis resolution. A senior White House official told news sources that Trump's claims about discussions with the highest people in Cuba originate from Secretary of State Marco Rubio's misrepresentation of bilateral relations. The suggestion is that Rubio, who has pursued Cuban regime change as a personal political objective for decades, may be deliberately preventing genuine negotiations to ensure diplomatic failure, making regime change the only path forward for an administration that might otherwise prefer a face-saving deal. The regime says it won't negotiate under pressure. Washington sends contradictory signals about whether it wants collapse or a deal. Russia and China pledge support but limit actual deliveries. The oil countdown continues. None of these positions tell you what actually happens when reserves hit zero. Let's map the possible pathways because the next 30 days will determine which future Cuba enters. The oil countdown creates urgency, but it doesn't determine outcomes. What happens next depends on decisions made in Washington, Havana, Moscow, Beijing, and Mexico City, and on variables including regime cohesion, public tolerance for suffering, and international willingness to either rescue Cuba or watch it collapse. Here are 5 scenarios, each grounded in current evidence, none guaranteed. Scenario 1. Negotiated partial opening. Russia, China, and Mexico stabilize a minimal oil supply of 30,000 to 40,000 barrels per day combined, just enough to prevent total grid collapse, but not enough to restore normal function. This buys time for negotiations. Facing an unsustainable humanitarian catastrophe, Cuba accepts partial reforms, economic liberalization, political prisoner releases, and foreign policy distancing from Russia. In exchange, the Trump administration suspends tariffs and allows limited sanctions relief, enough to import petroleum and essential goods. Trump wants wins he can claim as negotiated victories. A deal where Cuba makes symbolic concessions and Trump declares success allows both sides to avoid total war. The regime survives and Trump claims regime change without invasion. The humanitarian crisis stabilizes. However, hardliners within Cuba view any concession as an existential threat to the revolutionary system. Military elites may refuse reforms that undermine their economic control. On the U.S. side, Rubio and congressional Republicans may demand regime change, not reform, making a partial opening insufficient to lift pressure. Scenario 2. Permanent crisis state. International support provides just enough to prevent total failure, but not enough to restore normal function. Russia sends sporadic shipments, 20-day supplies every few months. China continues symbolic aid. Mexico provides humanitarian goods but no petroleum. Cuba survives at a subsistence level indefinitely. The crisis becomes a permanent condition, 12-hour blackouts continue, and severe scarcity becomes normalized. Healthcare deteriorates further, but the security apparatus maintains control because the population lacks organization, resources, or capacity for a sustained uprising. Cuba survived the 1990s special period after the Soviet collapse, when the GDP contracted 35%, food rationing intensified, and blackouts became routine. The regime endured through repression, immigration which drained dissidents, and eventual partial recovery when Venezuela's Chavez offered oil. This could be Special Period 2.0 with an indefinite duration because no equivalent rescuer exists. However, the current crisis differs from the 1990s in its comprehensiveness. Cuba faces simultaneous energy collapse, tourism paralysis, and a demographic exodus of 1 million people since 2021 with no plausible rescuer. Scenario 3. Regime fracture and transition. Oil runs out completely. The grid collapses entirely for days or weeks. Services fail comprehensively. The regime cannot provision even its core supporters, military elites, security apparatus, or party loyalists. When the regime can't feed, pay, or supply its own enforcers, unity breaks. Factions emerge, one arguing that negotiations with the United States represent survival, the other insisting on defiant resistance regardless of cost. A military coup becomes possible if senior officers conclude that Diaz-Canel's approach has failed and a transition government could secure international support. A military-led transition government negotiates with Washington for prisoner releases, constitutional reforms, and elections within a defined time frame in exchange for immediate sanctions relief and humanitarian aid. Alternatively, a reformist faction within the Communist Party initiates a gradual opening similar to Vietnam or China, implementing market reforms while maintaining party control. If total grid collapse triggers popular uprisings larger than July 2021, the regime's response determines the trajectory. Violent repression could accelerate elite fracture if military commanders refuse orders to fire on massive crowds. Scenario 4. U.S. military intervention. If a Supreme Court ruling jeopardizes authority for tariffs, the administration escalates to a full naval blockade. The U.S. Navy prevents all oil imports, even from Russia or China, through force. Alternatively, the humanitarian catastrophe creates political pressure within the United States for a rescue operation to protect civilians, deliver aid, and secure order. Do Moscow and Beijing run the blockade, deploying naval escorts for tankers to Cuba? Do they accept American hemispheric dominance and limit responses to diplomatic condemnation? These questions are unknowable until tested. This would represent the most significant U.S. military action in the Western Hemisphere since Panama in 1989 and the first direct confrontation with a state hosting Russian military infrastructure since the Cold War. The Lord's facility, with 400 to 500 Russian personnel, creates a tripwire risk. Scenario 5. Great power intervention or a face-saving deal. Moscow and Beijing decide to make Cuba a multipolarity demonstration, directly challenging U.S. hemispheric control by deploying tanker fleets and military escorts to deliver sufficient oil to stabilize Cuba, regardless of American threats. This is costly and risky, but possible as great power signaling. Meanwhile, Trump accepts a face-saving deal where Cuba makes symbolic concessions. Trump claims these as major victories, suspends tariffs, and declares success. Both sides avoid catastrophic outcomes while preserving core interests. This requires all major actors to shift positions simultaneously. Such alignment seems improbable, but not impossible. The oil countdown continues regardless of which pathway opens. What we know is that Cuba cannot sustain current operations without new petroleum supplies. What we don't know is whether the regime negotiates, fractures, endures, or gets toppled by external force. Cuba's crisis validates what Venezuela's collapse already demonstrated. Economic models built on external subsidies collapse when the patron disappears. Whether that patron is global oil prices, Soviet subsidies, or another country's petroleum shipments doesn't fundamentally matter. Dependency creates fatal vulnerability that no amount of ideological commitment can overcome. Venezuela had domestic oil infrastructure it could theoretically reactivate. Production collapsed due to corruption, sanctions, and mismanagement. But the resource exists underground. Cuba has no equivalent. It doesn't produce oil, it doesn't have natural gas reserves, and it doesn't have diversified exports that generate foreign currency. Cuba's only option was importing petroleum, and when superpowers decide to cut the supply, there's no fallback. For 25 years, Venezuela's subsidized oil masked the urgency of structural reform. Why develop solar infrastructure when petroleum arrives for free? Why restructure state enterprises when losses get covered by resold oil revenue? Why address agricultural collapse when you can import food with foreign currency? The dependency was comfortable until January 3rd, 2026. Then it became lethal. The lesson: subsidies that prevent pain also prevent adaptation. When they stop, the patient discovers the disease was terminal all along. Russia and China both condemn the blockade as illegal under the UN Charter. Both pledged solidarity and support, framing American pressure as unilateral overreach, yet both provided token assistance insufficient to prevent Cuba's collapse. Russia sent 100,000 tons of oil in January, 20 days of consumption. China sent $80 million and 60,000 tons of rice. These aren't trivial, but they're not decisive. Russia is constrained by the Ukraine war. China is unwilling to challenge U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere when it risks broader economic retaliation. Both value Cuba as a geopolitical signal, Russia's Lord's facility, and China's infrastructure projects, but neither values it enough to deploy tanker fleets through American naval interdiction. While analysts map scenarios and diplomats issue statements, 11 million Cubans face the cascade: 26-hour blackouts, surgery cancellations, water supply failures, food prices exceeding wages, diseases spreading without treatment, and mass immigration. Great powers pursue competing interests. The Trump administration tests whether economic siege can force regime change without invasion. Russia and China signal hemispheric presence while avoiding confrontation. Mexico navigates impossible choices between solidarity and economic survival. The Cuban regime frames resistance as revolutionary duty. Ordinary Cubans who didn't choose dependency on Venezuela or design the economic model endure the consequences of decisions made by elites in Havana, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. We don't know if the regime can negotiate. Diaz-Canel says dialogue is possible. Trump claims a deal is imminent. Other sources say substantive talks haven't begun. Rubio may be blocking negotiations. The gap between public messaging and actual diplomatic contact remains opaque, and that gap determines whether there's an off-ramp or an acceleration toward collapse. Elite cohesion under total system failure is untested. If the regime can't provision its enforcers, does unity fracture? The answer determines whether Cuba faces a managed transition, a military coup, chaotic fragmentation, or continued authoritarian control. By March, we'll have answers. Cuba either finds a lifeline, negotiates an exit, collapses internally, or faces external intervention. The unknowns resolve through events, not analysis. It's mid-February 2026. Cuba's oil reserves have likely reached critical levels. The grid operates sporadically. The geopolitical chess match proceeds, and the question remains: can 11 million people survive while great powers decide what happens to their island? The verdict isn't in yet, but the oil countdown continues. If this story changes how you view the fragile balance of global power and the human cost of geopolitical chess, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the history and the current events that some would rather keep buried. Let's plant the seeds of understanding for the future. The next chapter of this investigation will open soon.